Welcome everyone to tonight's webinar from the Kent and Sussex Planning Networks for Nature. So my name is Jack Thompson. I'm the RSPB's Conservation Officer for Sussex and other counties across the southeast as well. I'm here tonight to take a dive into the world of the common swifts and what policy and planning tools we have available to support the great work across the UK to recover this red listed species. I've been involved with the Brighton and Hove Swifts group for the past 6 years, and we have a fantastic group of volunteers covering a range of different roles to help the recovery of our swifts. And I just want to say a quick thanks to Sussex Wildlife Trust for allowing us to host tonight's webinar on Zoom. Before we get started, I've just got some quick housekeeping to run through. So as this is a Zoom webinar, you won't be able to turn on your video or microphone, but you will be able to ask questions using the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. So we've got some time allocated for a Q&A at the end of the session, but please do pop a question into the Q&A box at any time during the presentation, and we'll be able to pick these up at the end. It's very much welcome to send in questions as soon as you think of them, as if anyone's anything like me, they'd have forgotten the question by the time it's moved on a couple of slides. So it also allows us to jump straight into questions right from the off after the presentation. Also, I just want to state that the presentations in this session are being recorded and they'll be available on both the Planning Networks for Nature not too long after the event this evening. So on that note, let's jump into it. So what will I be covering in this whistle-stop tour of Swifts in policy and planning? And it is very much a whistle-stop tour. I just want to sort of cover the sort of basic ground for policy and planning for swifts. But firstly, we'll give a quick overview of swift ecology. It's always useful to start from here so we can all have a good understanding of what are the issues facing swifts and how policy can be applied to address this. We'll have an overview of Swift policy covering, things like the debate in Parliament last year and where this puts us currently. We'll then move on to the Brighton and Hove condition, what it encompasses and how we got there. I'll also cover very briefly some of the other examples that we're aware of across the country that just provide some useful context. And then after packaging together all the info from the previous topics, we'll run through how you can support policy for swifts within your own local authority. And finally, we'll end on a Q&A session. And as I said in the previous slide on housekeeping rules, please do feel free to pop any questions at all in the Q&A section of Zoom at any point during the talk. So hopefully everyone in this virtual room knows what a swift is and looks like, but just for those who may not, I've got some lovely imagery on this slide of that iconic scythe-shaped figure of the common swift. And these birds are just built for the air and are the fastest bird in level flight. The scientific name for the common swift is Apus apus, which literally means without feet, as early taxonomists could not see the tiny feet that common swifts possess. So either way, they're adapted for a very long amount of time on the wing with the small but very, very strong feet able to grasp things like vertical walls, but they're just not very useful for landing. And where do they nest? So we're lucky enough to share our homes with swifts. So they nest predominantly in cavities in walls and roof spaces, and these birds have found their homes in all sorts of nooks and crannies alongside humans. So when do we see these birds? Well, they are summer migrants where they winter in many different countries in southern Africa and make an incredible journey around the Sahara, across the Mediterranean and finally to the UK for a very short period of around 3 to 4 months to breed. And then they're back on their way again, and it's an incredible feat and makes these birds all the more impressive. They even sleep on the wing as well. So they use a process which has an incredibly catchy name of unihemispheric slow wave sleep to switch off half of their brain whilst the other stays awake. And this allows them to stay on the wing for so long, with some juveniles that don't even land until breeding age at around 3 to 4 years old. And it's just truly mind-blowing. And how are these birds faring? Well, recent data from the Breeding Bird Survey suggests a 62% decline in swift population abundance in a 26-year change from 1995 to 2021. And as a result of these declines, the common swift has made its way onto the UK's red list in the latest Birds of Conservation Concern report number 5. What's causing these declines in our swift populations? Well, as a science-led organisation, the RSPB is governed by science, and as it currently stands, we unfortunately don't quite have the full picture yet, due to the nature of swifts being airborne so much, spending large amounts of the year in a whole range of wintering areas in Africa, and the large variety of feeding areas, radius of where they're feeding, and diversity of invertebrate prey species. It makes it quite difficult to gather all the evidence to have a concrete idea of what is causing their declines definitively. However, what we do know is twofold. Modern building and renovation practices have led to a loss in suitable nesting sites for our swifts. More and more swifts are making the long journey to the UK and finding their previous nest sites covered up or blocked by scaffolding. Without alternatives or initiatives in place to increase these nest sites with bricks or boxes, we can be confident that this will have some effect on our swift populations, and therefore the safeguarding of existing nest sites and the provision of new nest sites will hopefully provide support for our declining swift population. And secondly, it's well documented that over the last few decades, we have seen incredible declines in insects due to land use changes and a reduction in the diversity of plants and just general biodiversity across farmland and other key habitats. And swifts feed on flying invertebrates, and although their diet is hugely complex and wide-ranging, any ways in which we can increase flying insect food availability will likely be beneficial for swifts amongst other, general biodiversity too. So we have some things that we can do to support swifts, and how does policy and planning fit into all of this? We got some limited time this evening to cover this topic, so the focus tonight will be more around Swiftbrick initiatives and increasing suitable nest sites. I could go into the topic of nature-friendly farming and advocating further for policies and funding around increasing biodiversity on farmland, for example, but that could easily take up over an hour of a webinar itself. So we're just going to focus in a little bit more on Swiftbricks and planning. So on the 10th of July, 2023, MPs gathered to debate on the petition Make Swiftbricks Compulsory in New Housing to Help Red-Listed Birds, which received over 100,000 signatures. And although I don't want to cast any kind of shadow over some great pieces of work already delivered across many different parts of the country before this point, it felt that this was a bit of a Kickstarter for the conversation around Swift-related policy, with some really good media coverage on the subject as well. Unfortunately, the outcome of the debate wasn't what we all wanted, but it has laid down the foundation to promote the need for local government policy on increasing nest site availability for swifts. A follow-up document, which was called a debate pack, was then produced, where the government said it would not legislate to require developers or local authorities to use particular forms of building material, such as swift bricks, in every development. And now the government said that particular forms of green infrastructure, such as swift bricks, were not suitable to all developments. However, the debate pack then just goes on to state the potential to use planning conditions and obligations alongside council initiatives at that sort of local scale to enact change for swift policy. So it very much feels that local government and policy seems to be the best way forward for groups to secure swift bricks in their local areas. And with that in mind, I'd just like to cover what we achieved across Brighton and Hove. So at the RSPB, we engage with planning processes across a multitude of local authorities on various biodiversity matters. Advocating for policy on swifts is something that we incorporated into our responses already. But in addition to this, we reached out to local councillors interested in swift and bee-brick policies as advocates for our cause, and the councillors themselves involved were extremely useful in supporting the push for the conversation in council around these subjects. The RSPB presented at deputations in the committee meetings for the Committee of Tourism, Qualities, Communities and Culture. So that was just one of the examples of the committees that make up the wider Brighton and Hove City Council. And these deputations are essentially speeches given by members of the public to a committee or full council itself. And these are representatives that give these deputations, these speeches. So usually there will be a required number of signatures from residents to put forward a deputation request. Normally it's not too many, you know, you're not looking at a large, like sort of, you know, tens of signatures, but at least, you know, a handful of signatures that can make up that kind of group putting forward that deputation. And these deputations can be on any topic which the council has power to act on. So in this case, on policy and conditions for Swiftbrick provision, which is something that the council is able to include and create policy for. So usually for these deputations as well, you only get about 5 minutes for each. So they have to be, you know, short and snappy. After multiple discussions with the committee, a notice of motion was put forward to be agreed by the council. So further supporting information or wording was provided at this point, just to assist in that approval process and get that buy-in to the committee members so that they would then, you know, approve that notice of motion. After the agreement from the committee, more concrete wording for a condition and also for a supplementary informal guidance note was produced. So, what ended up being created is something that looks very much like the image that you can see on the right-hand side there. And just for context as well, so conditions are measures that can be attached to planning permission by local planning authorities to make the development acceptable from a planning perspective. And these planning conditions also have requirements from the local planning authority setting them. So importantly, they need to be necessary, they need to be enforceable, they need to be relevant to planning and to the development itself. And finally, they need to be reasonable as well. And that sort of like kind of reasonable is really key in how we can get the best kind of wording to come forward and make its way into policy within local planning authorities. So during the process of getting the condition wording in place, ongoing conversations were had with the ecologist for East Sussex, who supported this piece of work. I mean, their ecologist has been critical in ensuring that biodiversity checklists and enhancements are being provided on major developments across the whole of the city, you know, well before things like biodiversity net gain was discussed as becoming mandatory. So, so they were really, really useful in helping to support us in getting that message across in terms of the wording that would be required for a condition. We also as well had at Brighton and Hove Swiss group, we had a pair of volunteers who would get in touch with case officers on development applications that would fulfill the requirement for a condition as a friendly reminder for the new requirement coming through once we got that concrete condition in place and that supplementary guidance. They'd then be able to keep an eye on those developments from application validation through to approval with the case officer's report and all of the conditions applied to that development. And as you're all probably familiar with, planning processes can take a very long time to go from start to finish. So we're only just now seeing the rewards of the condition and bricks being implemented into finished, you know, construction and actual developed buildings. And as a result of this really hard work, we've had over 440 bricks conditioned into new development across the city. I've got a slightly out of date map now that just showcases where these developments can be found spread across the whole of the city, as you can kind of see on this map on the right hand side. With sites around key hotspots, like key hotspot areas, alongside some potential corridors as well. We're really hopeful that connectivity of nest site availability will be enhanced for the future if these bricks are in place. So we're now into the next stage of all of this, whereby conditions have been applied, and the question is now on enforcement. So what we need to do as next steps is to check if the bricks have been put in place, and I'm in touch myself with the enforcement team at Brighton and Hove City Council to support them on those that haven't, you know, fulfilled the requirements of the condition, and keeping them up to date with those that are coming through and that have recently, you know, gone through that process from start to finish. And with all of this in place, we're really just hopeful that we can switch the trends for swift populations across Brighton and Hove, alongside other areas of work that the group is also involved in. And So I'd just like to take the time to quickly say that the successes we've had in Brighton and Hove in getting this over the line would not have been possible if not for the fantastic hard work of our volunteers, the council, committees, their case officers, ecologists, and also the councillors that were involved in this. And it was just a great piece of collaborative work to get to where we are now. And just as a final note on what we're doing in Brighton and Hove, it's so important that we are sharing our experiences on webinars like this evening, and also on networks like Planning Networks for Nature. There isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to getting Swiftbrick policy in place for local government, but we can use case studies and reference good practice between ourselves, which will provide us with a much enhanced set of tools to be able to progress these things in our areas. And if we collaborate, we can problem solve together and build a better picture for the future of Swifts across our counties. So also on the note of experience sharing, I've just briefly included some further examples as well. So please do feel free to take a look at some of this information. And I'll hopefully be uploading some of this guidance onto the Planning Networks for Nature as well. And this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but I just wanted to highlight some of the other successes for Swiftbrick provision across England. It also shows the variability in the avenues groups have gone down in order to secure policy for Swiftbrick provision, from biodiversity supplementary planning documents, also known as SPDs, to design guides and biodiversity or species action plans. However, there is consistency in the wording and lots of useful materials available online to help support anyone wishing to progress with brick conditions. So just to sum everything up that I've spoken about, and like I say, got on a real whistle-stop tour of everything about Swiss planning and policy, I'd just like to go through some key things to consider as initial steps on what to include with advocating for Swiftbrick provision in planning and policy. So firstly, get a warm council contact to help advocate the cause and get that spot in the relevant committee meeting. Usually this is someone with a green track record or has been known to look at similar initiatives. Get together your group to propose and put in a deputation request. So prepare really well for this, making sure that the presentation is concise, it's punchy, as time will be really limited with lots to discuss in these meetings for the committees. And you can do this by getting your key localized facts to enhance the local importance of a policy such as this. So use any survey information that you currently have, or head on to SwiftMapper to gain that information in your local authority to build up a picture of Swift activity, and then you can showcase that within your deputation. And importantly, make sure that it's emphasized the ease in which these conditions can be applied, the urgency of it that we need, for these to take place, and that it's both enforceable and reasonable under the requirements of the planning conditions for local government. And I've also as well just highlighted some specifics to include in terms of wording when it comes to the development of these conditions as well. So it's really important that we include things like height requirements, such as for example in Brighton and Hove we have 5 meters from the eaves of the building to the ground to ensure that Swift bricks go up in the right places. And there's also the British Standards Institute, which provides standards for building work in the UK, and that has a specification for inbuilt nesting boxes. So referring to any kind of guidance notes for developers to this will help provide easy to follow and standardized processes, which will all be in developer vocabulary. It's also really important that the specific number required per dwelling should be stated. So for Brighton and Hove, this is a minimum of 3 like kind of Swift bricks or Swift boxes if a brick can't be provided due to sort of the design of the building, whether it's not using brickwork, etc., or it's 2 per residential unit, whichever is higher. There's also wording for commercial buildings using floor space as a calculator alongside major development as well. So we're covering a multitude of different examples across development across the city. Use example wording. So if you're able to as well, continue the dialogue with the planning department when the condition is being worked up. So please do feel free to take a look at what's been worked up for Brighton and Hove and some of those other examples as well, and use that wording to build up like kind of, you know, what that condition looks like within your local authority. Ensure that the requirements are worded very, very simply without taking anything away from the information presented. So we want to make this as easy as possible for policymakers and developers alike to follow these conditions. And finally, as I mentioned with Brighton and Hove Swifts, supporting the implementation phase is really critical to ensuring that the policy is being applied correctly and that it can be enforced at the construction and completion stages, so that we've got that full package of monitoring what's being applied with that condition, and that it is actually going through all the way through to the completion of the development. So that brings me to the end of a very brief conversation around Swift policy and planning. So just thank you everyone for watching and listening to this talk. If you'd like to talk more about Swifts in general, about wider sort of things around Swift, you know, whether or not you're looking to set up your own sort of surveys or anything about like kind of Swift stuff, please do get in touch with me. My email address is on this slide. If you'd like to discuss things specific to Brighton and Hove Swifts, please get in touch with the group at bhswifts@rspb.org.uk. We also have the link to SwiftMapper in this slide as well, so please do check that out if you haven't looked at that already, because there's really useful data on there that's perfect for these sorts of situations. And finally, to continue the conversation on Swift policy in Sussex and Kent, please do sign up and take a look at the Planning Networks for Nature. There's a whole range of other topics of interest on there, all about supporting biodiversity across the counties through planning and policy. So yeah, please do check them out. So yeah, thanks very much, everyone. I will stop sharing my screen now so I can take a look at the Q&A for any questions that have come through. So yeah, like I say, thank you very much. Okay, right, let's take a look at what has come through. So we've got first question up is from Graham, which is one of the Hertfordshire local authorities won't go down the Brighton route of an SPD because they say it may not be legal and Swiftbrick conditions could be appealed. They insist on waiting for the next draft local plan. Okay, yeah, so yes, bit of a nuanced case with this one, and I think that's sort of what I wanted to emphasize, that it's not a one size fits all sort of case for Swift policy. What I would say on this, I know it's a bit difficult to have a bit of a back and forth on this particular webinar with the sort of Q&A function, but is if you haven't gone down the route of that sort of deputation and like kind of, you know, reaching out to the committees, that might be the best approach to take in this example, is starting those conversations with the committees and trying to get that kind of like buy-in from that, you know, from that angle, and then there can be that discussion amongst the committee of what might be the most suitable way of getting that through. So I just want to also highlight that the ongoing conversations within Brighton and Hove did include our sort of engagement with the local plan process. So Brighton and Hove City Council were going through their city plan. So they produced part one of the city plan, and they were in between part one and part two in developing those and getting through the sort of policy wording to complete this latest round of the city plan. So we did manage to get in the Swift wording into that. So it does also very much help if the timings are right for when the local plan processes are coming through at the right stages to get in the Swift provision of that Swift wording. But yeah, I would say that that's probably the best way to go through and tackle this, is just to try and get those deputations in and get that conversation started at a committee level, rather than perhaps like kind of waiting for like kind of local plan consultation stages where you just, you know, you put in your local plan responses. Obviously do those as well, but it's just useful to have those separate conversations as well to try and progress things. So second question we've got is, are the case officers volunteers or council employees? So checking if effective implementation has been one of the main issues, and also a reason why many councils simply don't bother. Yes, so the volunteers were RSPB volunteers for the Brighton and Hove Swifts group. So we were very mindful of the fact that in enforcement teams in councils, or councils in general, planning teams are under huge resource pressures, and we knew from the off that it would be unlikely that they'd be able to, cover in full everything that we wanted to for this condition to achieve. And we, with the very large number of applications that were coming through that would be suitable for it. So we wanted to make sure that we could remind the case officers at every opportunity, so that no one would forget, because whenever you've got a new condition coming through, or any new kind of policy, always at the beginning when they're just sort of settling into things, it can easily be forgotten. So we're just trying to make sure that there's that constant reminder in there, and then when it comes to enforcement, unfortunately, it's on us to to try and highlight the range of developments that haven't fulfilled the condition, and then bring that information to the enforcement team and package that up in a way in which it makes it as time effective as possible for them to then to go through their processes to make sure that these things are in place. So I hope that helps to answer that question. So Nikki's just asked if I can share slides after this event. Yeah, I will. I'll send across like a slides pack with these slides in. What I'll do is I will upload those onto the Planning Networks for Nature, so everyone can have access to that. Alongside the recording will be made available as well on the networks too. So just not a question, but just a really informative and lots of useful pointers. Thank you very much. So Martin asked, does biodiversity net gain give a way into encouraging provision of boxes? So this is something that's been discussed quite a lot around Swiftbrick provision. Unfortunately, biodiversity net gain doesn't cover. Biodiversity net gain looks at the habitat level, so it looks at the value of habitats and the provision of habitats. It doesn't look at species and species recovery, so it's one of the sort of the potential holes that we have within biodiversity net gain, because obviously the habitats in which it provides feeding areas and natural nest sites in the forms of scrub and trees, etc., for other other birds. It does provide that function there for them, but it doesn't necessarily encapsulate every species and their requirements. So there are unfortunately species that do get left out in this, and swifts are very much one of those. So we have to try and look through other mechanisms in order to try and implement this and get Swiftbrick provision in place, because it is an enhancement of biodiversity, but it's just not something that falls within biodiversity net gain. So yes, that's why we've been advocating for getting this forward, and hopefully through things like local nature recovery strategies, it's something that it can be considered within that, because it is also looking at the species level of things as well. So we've also just got a many thanks from Nikki. So Graham just says to mention that neighbourhood plans are also a great way to get Swiftbrick policies in place. Yes, so obviously didn't have the time to cover absolutely everything, but yes, a really great point, Graham. Neighbourhood plans are very much something that can help assist with that process, especially when you have local authorities where you've got perhaps one area, one sort of town that has a neighbourhood plan associated with it, that is a hotspot for swifts, and then quite a lot of kind of rural areas where there aren't much in the way, isn't much in the way of development or anything like that in place. Looking at the neighbourhood plan side of things is a very a good alternative to that as well. So and yeah, like you say, Graham, they are easier to engage with and persuade sometimes. So I will just I'll just perhaps answer one more question because I'm just mindful of time. But what I will do is also for any questions that haven't been answered, um, please do just take those answers and feel free to just post them on the network because we'd be more than happy to run through them and answer them and continue this conversation on the network. So please do keep those questions in mind there. So Nikki asks, is it reasonable to ask the colleges to consult and take note of Swift Mapper records in their reports for planning applications? So Swift Mapper is a really useful resource to be able to sort of advocate for where there is a good presence and abundance of Swifts, whether that be like sort of nest sites or activity generally low flying parties. In terms of like sort of concrete data for it as a citizen science project, there's the ability that some of the records might not be as reliable as others. So in terms of how that might hold in whether or not a planning application is successful or not, then there might be a further evidence base that might be required, but it's a really great start for 10 to then explore on whether or not there is the presence of nesting swifts around a development, and then also as well obviously the consideration of whether or not there's a need for a local authority wide condition around swifts as well. I'm just very mindful of time. So what I will have to do is just close things for now. So like I say, please do pop any questions that haven't been answered onto the network as well. And we've got a fantastic group of volunteers that are monitoring the network, so please do send across any suggestions that you have and we can follow up. And also as well, we'll be looking to get more regular webinars organized on the platform for a variety of different partners and organizations to follow up on. So please do keep an eye on the events page for anything coming up soon. And also as well, if you do have any suggestions for what you would like to find out more information about on planning and biodiversity, please do let us know as well, and and get in touch on the network. So I just wanted to take the opportunity again just to thank everyone all so much for coming along tonight, and please do continue this conversation over on the networks, and come and ask any follow-up questions, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your evening and take care.